Okay.
It's wonderful to welcome Tom Switzer and Sue Windybank to the podcast. They both work at the Center for Independent Studies, and they serve as editors of the newly published collection of writings by the great foreign policy thinker Owen Harries. It is titled Prudence and Power, the Writings of Owen Harries. Sue, Tom, welcome to the show. How are you both?
Lovely to
Great
be
to
with you.
join you.
Okay, so I understand that in Australia the weather is warmer. So Merry summer Christmas to you.
Warmer than Hungary.
Yes.
Yes, it's very sweaty.
Okay, so let's begin by you telling us about the Center for Independent Studies, and to what extent is Owen part of it?
Well, the Centre for Independent Studies is a classical liberal public policy research organisation that was created in 1976. So we're soon going to celebrate our 50th anniversary. We have a budget of about $5 million, have full-time staff of about 15 people. And when Owen Harries finished his long tenure as editor of the National Interest in Washington in 2001, he returned to Australia, where he had lectured in political science and foreign policy at universities of New South Wales and Sydney in the 50s and 60s and early to mid 70s. And Greg Lindsay, who was my predecessor, the founder of CIS, wanted to offer him a fellowship in foreign policy. And it was perfect timing because it coincided with the September 11 terror attacks. And for the next few years, Owen emerged as one of not just Australia's, but one of the world's leading conservative critics of the Bush administration's war on terror. And he did that at CIS
So tell me, how did the September 11
in the
attacks influence his thinking?
Well, he was very quick off the mark to recognize, as he wrote, that this had reawoken America's sense of mission. And I think within about 4 months of the attacks, he delivered an outstanding public lecture warning of the neocons' desire to reshape the world and America's image and to spread liberal democracy around the world as an antidote to terrorism. And he was very prescient in warning that this would generate a backlash, and in fact warned that the real tragedy of September 11th would be that the initial sympathy that was felt for the United States, remember Le Monde said we're all Americans now, dissipated very, very quickly because of the way America acted after 9/11 in throwing its weight around. Would you like to add to that, Tom?
Yeah, I was just going to say that Owen always used to make the point that in the immediate aftermath of the September 11 terror attacks, there were three things. There was obviously American outrage over the terror attacks in both New York and in Washington, and of course the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. So American outrage combined with the notion of American exceptionalism, the idea that America is different, and then the mental habits of American global liberal hegemony. So those three things led to a combustive mixture, and that culminated in the Bush administration's doctrine of preventive war, regime change, and democracy promotion that ultimately led to the invasion of Iraq, which Owen opposed.
We should add that it was very personal for Owen too, because he knew so many of these neoconservatives. He'd published them, he had interacted with them over the years. Many of them were his friends. So he was arguing against these people that he'd had so much in common with prior to 9/11. So it was personal as well as, a question of conviction.
Yeah, it's always difficult when you're arguing with your friends, and Owen felt a lot of anxiety on his part, but ultimately, I think he felt a sense of vindication as well, intellectually.
So you both agree that time has proven him right in his position in regards to the Bush administration foreign policy and Iraq in particular.
I think that's the overwhelming consensus. The war was unnecessary because the threat that Saddam posed could have been contained the way it had been since the previous Gulf War of 1991. The naval blockade, the sanctions, the no-fly zone, and just the principles of deterrence that if Saddam ever used weapons of mass destruction, which of course he never had, but if he ever used WMD, it would guarantee massive retaliation, perhaps even annihilation. So I think sex appeal of liberation and the only a Shia We now know that the Shia were intent on exacting revenge on their former Sunni tormentors, and that ultimately led to the rise of Sunni jihadists such as Islamic State, which made the terror problem actually worse. He never really went to great lengths to say, I was right and you were wrong. He was not that kind of guy. He was a very modest chap. But I think privately he knew that the whole thing was quite sad and tragic and humiliating for America, which he did not want to see. He loved America. He thought that a strong America was a very important part of the global environment. And he thought this would damage American credibility and prestige and cost much in blood and treasure, which it did. But he also, as Sue will not recognize, Owen always often made the point that America has enormous demonstrated capacity for change and renewal, even after major setbacks.
I think he identified too, a flaw that he often used to draw out in the neoconservative argument. What they wouldn't ever argue for domestically, they seem to have no problem advocating for internationally. They were against social engineering at home, but when it came to social engineering beyond their borders, they suddenly believed that it could perform miracles. It was a fundamental contradiction in suspicion about government power at home, but then this almost unwavering faith that it could perform miracles abroad, which I think we still see today, right?
Yeah.
So in the wake of the Bush's decision to invade Iraq, Owen Harries delivered the extraordinary Boyer lectures, so stating his position aloud. And there's one that I can remember where he discusses the traditions of Australian foreign policy as compared to America's. So I'd like to ask you, so from Owen's perspective, what is Australian foreign policy?
Well, he published an article at the National Interest towards the end of his tenure by someone who's now very prominent, but at the time wasn't so well known, and that was Walter Russell Mead, who talked about the four traditions in American foreign policy. And from memory, they were the Washingtonian tradition, the Jacksonian tradition, the Jeffersonian tradition, and the Hamiltonian tradition. I won't go into explain what they were about. I'm sure listeners of your program have a fair sense of what I'm talking about. So he tried to apply that kind of way of looking at things to Australia, and he came up with three traditions. Basically, the realist tradition, which basically stressed that all things considered, Australia had a great interest in following the lead of what Robert Menzies, our longest-serving Prime Minister, called our great and powerful friends. Then there was the sort of the legal internationalist tradition, which placed heavy emphasis on international institutions, most notably the United Nations. And Australia's security was best served by cleaving closely to the ideals of Wilsonian idealism. And then the other tradition was regionalism, which was based on the foreign policy views of a coalition or a conservative foreign minister named Richard Evett and a former Labor Prime Minister, Paul Keating. And Owen wasn't absolute. He wasn't dogmatic. I mean, he himself was a realist, but he acknowledged that if you look at Australia's foreign policy outlook since 1901, when we became an independent state from Britain, at various stages throughout our history, statesmen and policymakers and prime ministers alike have embraced all three traditions, often balancing each other. So, look, it was a very good essay, and it really contributed a significant argument to the historiography of Australian foreign policy.
So, assuming that Owen lived throughout the John Howard premiership, so which of these three traditions would he place Howard in?
Oh, he strongly put John Howard in the great power tradition. That is, Australia has a very important national interest in supporting, as I said before, great and powerful friends, as Robert Menzies put it. So Howard was a strong supporter of both Britain. Of course, Britain's power had declined dramatically since the Suez Crisis of 1956, and Howard developed a very close relationship with the then Prime Minister Tony Blair, but also the US President George W. Bush. And Howard made a big point of, I wouldn't say unconditional and unqualified support. I wouldn't use those words, but certainly very strong support for the American and the British position in the Middle East wars.
John Howard was also in Washington when 9/11 happened, so I think that affected him personally, as well as sensing that Australia needed to support the United States. We were one of the three amigos, so to speak, that went into the Iraq War along with Tony Blair. And he saw that it was a very niche and boutique contribution to the war. But he saw that very much in terms of alliance management and paying our dues to the United States, as Tom said, our great and powerful friend. And Owen was critical of that because he gave that support unconditionally and without being asked.
So nowadays, I believe the trilateral Australia, Britain, US agreement has been signed. So AUKUS, as it is called. So it looks like Australia is heading towards the Menzies, staying close to the Anglo-American sphere as possible. Is this a step forward or a step backward if Owen was alive to see it today?
Well, Owen was a big believer in looking at the circumstances, and his view was that when the Cold War came to an end and the Soviet Empire collapsed, it made sense to reorder America's strategic priorities, and as a result, Australia's strategic priorities. You know, when the facts change, you change your mind, as John Maynard Keynes put it. And Owen, throughout the 90s and the 2000s, like most people in the West, supported a policy of engagement with People's Republic of China. But towards the end of his life, I think Owen recognised that China, not unreasonably, not surprisingly, as it converted its impressive economic credentials into strategic credentials, military assets, China would seek a sphere of influence in its near abroad and try to, impose space on which its future security and prosperity depend. And the problem, though, is that the established country in the region, the United States, which has kept the peace more or less since Vietnam, has imposed rules and norms that the broad cross-section of the states in the region, especially Australia, have been very satisfied with. The Americans will go to great lengths to stop China's rise. And I think Owen recognized that if China's rise continued, it would make sense for Australia to hedge against China via Uncle Sam. But he was never absolute about it because the Australian debate on China didn't really change until about 2017. And by that stage, Owen, he was very rarely talking about foreign affairs, only privately to people like me. So he wasn't really advocating a certain policy. But I think he placed a lot of emphasis on circumstance. And as he saw China's rise continue, he probably would have become more skeptical of engagement with China. But he'd also, I have to stress, be conscious of getting too close to the Americans, lest a piece of the scaffolding fall off and hurt us in the process, as he put it.
So how did Owen view the Cold War? Why, or more specifically, why did he believe that one side had to win and it is the side of the Western powers?
When Owen Harries graduated from Oxford in the early 1950s, he was a socialist, like a lot of post-war Brits, especially those in their 20s. Clement Attlee was prime minister, and socialism was fairly popular in Britain, post-war Britain. But then when he came to Australia in the 50s and taught at the University of Sydney, he met an academic colleague named Professor Harry Eddy from the University of Sydney, who over time converted him towards adopting a more anti-communist position in the Cold War. And Owen, like a lot of Cold Warriors in the 50s and the 60s, looked at the Cold War through a moral prism, not just a great power prism, but a moral prism. And ultimately, America represented the forces of good, and the Soviet Union represented the forces of darkness. So, like Irving Kristol, who later became a very close friend of his, and people who later became known as neoconservatives, Owen took a very strongly moralistic view about the Soviet Union because he believed the Soviet Union wanted to impose its will and leadership, not just across Europe, but around the world through spreading communism. And it was America's responsibility to contain the spread of communism.
Wonderful. So how would you define the term neoconservatives and neoconservatism?
There have been whole books written about that. But I do think the catchphrase "liberal mugged by reality" is a pretty good way of summing it up. And I think what happened at the end of the Cold War occurred, a lot of liberals suddenly remembered their old left liberalism and what had served well to keep the kind of conservative anti-communist movement together during the Cold War kind of splintered, and the neocons was one of those splinter groups.
I understand that the neoconservative, at least in terms of foreign policy, arose in the 70s in reaction to the hardcore realists. I guess they saw Kissinger as an emblem of this phenomenon, and they they push the view that the Cold War should be seen on moral terms rather than in strategic terms. And well,
That's right.
Owen agreed with this faction, the moralistic faction. So I wondered, to what extent can realism be balanced with this moral view of international affairs?
Well, I think during the Cold War, because it was both a power struggle and a moral struggle, it worked very well together. But I think after the Cold War ended, that moral fight, power fight, wasn't there anymore. And in some ways, the neoconservatives went in search of monsters to destroy, and overreached, and America succumbed to hubris.
Yeah, and I think Owen was, if you like, marched in lockstep with the neoconservatives in the 1970s and the 1980s on the Cold War. But for Owen, the big event of his lifetime was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And in his judgment, those two events really demanded a profound reassessment of foreign policy. And that meant a scaling down of commitments and a reordering of priority in favor of prudence, restraint, selectivity, pick and choose where you throw your weight around the world. And in 1997, he gave a great quote to the Sydney Morning Herald. He was the editor of the National Interest. And he made the point, I'm going to quote him, if we spend 40 or 50 years saying the Cold War was a tremendously important event, a critical life and death struggle, then for Christ's sakes, the end of the Cold War must also be important. You can't just say, well, it's finished, but that doesn't mean much. The world goes on pretty much as it is. You see, when the life and death struggle ends, it's supposed to make a very large difference, and I think it has. And that's where he turned when the circumstances changed. But for a lot of his neoconservative friends, not all, but most of them, they still believe that America should exploit the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union by being the predominant power and imposing its will and influence across the globe, a Pax Americana, global leadership, a benign global hegemony. All these were the buzzwords in Washington in the 1990s. And Owen would often write pieces raising doubts about that worldview, saying that America needed to reorder its priorities. And that made him a different figure, particularly on the
In
right
the
side of
words,
politics.
in the words of John Kirkpatrick, he used to quote, America needed to become a normaler country again and attend to problems at home. That didn't happen, of course, and particularly after 9/11. Remember that President Bush came in saying that he was going to lead a humble foreign policy, but that just went completely out the window after 9/11, and the neocons became ascendant in the debates, and we had the Iraq fiasco, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so
Even Obama tried.
I was just going to say the two big events, of course, are the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's one, and that was in the late 80s and early 1990s. And then the next big one, of course, was a decade later with September 11. And they really shook Owen's mindset and America's.
So I suppose the Owens' time as editor of the National Interest was 1989 to 2001. So the two milestones of history there. And one of the most important and most well-known pieces ever published on that magazine is the one titled "The End of History," written by a rather obscure RAND Corporation employee, Francis Fukuyama. Right now, I think both the name Francis Fukuyama and the concept of the end of history has kind of become a cliche. So, to your knowledge, how and why did Owen decided that this piece should see publication?
Well, Owen was a very good talent spotter, and if you met someone, however young, and Frank Fukuyama was pretty young, I think he was in his mid-30s at the time. Sue, is that right? In the late 80s? Yeah, it would have been early to mid-30s perhaps. And when he put the idea that the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union represented the end point in humankind's ideological evolution and the triumph of Western liberal democracy, Owen did not agree with it.
No,
Because Fukuyama's fundamental conclusion was that this would mean that war would be a thing of the past and the world would become more bored. A bit like Immanuel Kant. Owen was a realist. He recognized that insecurity and conflict are inevitable byproducts of the international system, like all good realists think. So he had no time for this naive, idealistic thesis. But he recognized it reflected a moment in history.
Mm.
And so he encouraged Frank to write the piece. They went to great lengths to go back and forth with edits. And, the rest is history. As soon as the piece was published,
I
some
think he
editions.
came up with the title, didn't he? I think it was
He
called
did.
Hegelian Reflections on something or rather very wordy and academic, and he suggested the end of history with that all-important question mark at the end, which
Absolutely.
people often forget. But I recall he disagreed profoundly with the piece.
Yes.
But when he published it alongside, I think, about 6 responses to the thesis, which he invited. So it became a special issue of the magazine, which I've still got, actually. You would have that issue as well, wouldn't you, Tom? He gave me a copy.
I think they're both autographed by Frank and Owen.
Yeah.
But the intriguing thing, though, that piece was published in the northern summer of 1989. So the best part of 4 or 5 months before the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it represented a moment. And Owen always remembers, I think someone at the New York Times or the Washington Post wrote a story about the essay by Fukuyama. And before you know it, this is well before the days of the internet. Number 10, Margaret Thatcher was in number 10 at Prime Minister of Britain, was demanding copies of the article. And it was reprinted around the world. Yeah. And that's what catapulted not just Frank Fukuyama to international stardom, but it really made the National Interest a major journal of foreign policy opinion.
So 35 years after the article was published, so I'm asking for your personal viewpoint here. Do you see it as an example of naive optimism or something more prophetic?
Naive. It was idealistic. I think what's interesting is that Frank Fukuyama himself has recently revisited the whole thesis with Ukraine. He's talked about the spirit of 1989 reborn, and he sees Ukraine and the fight against the Russian invasion very much as a demonstration of the importance of his thesis, and that we should push back against authoritarianism. I think he's been proven wrong. I mean, he predicted that Russia would be defeated within 6 months. He's really stuck his neck out. And I find it extraordinary after what's happened in 30 years since he published that he is still getting a hearing.
I mean, my own view, I like Frank at a personal level, and I think that thesis represented a moment in time, and if you like, reflected almost a conventional wisdom about the state of the world. That essay, along with another essay by Charles Krauthammer in Foreign Affairs magazine about the unipolar moment, I think those 2 essays were the 2 most influential essays of the post-Cold War era. Some might say Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, but that never really represented the mindset in Washington the way that Krauthammer and Fukuyama's theses did. So I think they really had a lot of relevance and consequence for American foreign policy. However, to get back to your question, 35 years later, I think what you're seeing here is not the end of history or the triumph of Western liberal democracy. We're seeing something that people like Fukuyama said was a thing of the past. That is the resurgence of great power security competition. And it's here where I think one of Frank's ideological nemesis, John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, I think his thesis has that he wrote in 2001 called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, the thesis of great power competition, that is becoming more mainstream now than the end of history.
Yeah. I know that Professor Mearsheimer of the U of Chicago recently visited CIS. So I understand that you guys had a great time hosting him.
Well, I think John's a highly intelligent and very prominent scholar of international affairs. He's also an outstanding public speaker and performer on stage. And he's a brilliant teacher. He really connects with his students. And it's really evident when you see him in action with students, as I have, both at the University of Chicago and in my dealings with him in Australia. And I think his thesis looks more prescient than Fukuyama's or Krauthammer's or Sam Huntington. And I think this is not a minority view, by the way. A few years ago, Foreign Affairs magazine published an article by a professor of international relations named Richard Betts, and he made the same point that ultimately Mearsheimer's power politics thesis trumps Huntington and Fukuyama.
Especially when it comes to China. He was very much a lone voice warning about engagement with China. I mean, who would have listened back then? We all hoped that China would develop along more liberal lines.
And Western policymakers, again, following on from your point about Fukuyama in the 1990s, there was a widespread assumption that the more China would embrace capitalism and market economics, the more likely it would be more liberal and tolerant at home and more peaceful abroad. China did not follow the Fukuyama script.
No, and I think that goes to a real weak spot both in Fukuyama's thesis, but also when classical liberals think about foreign policy as well, in that they really underestimate the power of nationalism, which is the world's oldest ideology. The
And that is
European
precisely
Union.
Mishama's point.
Yeah, and we see this even with the European Union, created to try and displace, loyalty to the nation state. But it just keeps resurfacing. It's a real blind spot of liberalism.
Yeah. And I think starting at the mid-2010s, we see a backlash towards liberalism in many ways, shape, or form. Of course, the famous book that was published around this time is Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen of University of Notre Dame. So to the extent that Owen writes about liberalism, what did he see are some of his crucial weaknesses that may have led this backlash to happen?
Faith in the United Nations. Owen never believed that the United Nations replaced power politics. It just disguised power politics. I hope that makes sense. In other words, great powers still have immense influence and power to shape events more so than institutions. So that was one aspect. And I think he was skeptical of the idealism, this notion that economic interdependency would lead to harmony and peace. And he just looked at people's who were very interdependent, like the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that didn't lead to peace and harmony. Or the Pakistanis and the Indians. They were very close, but, they had 3 major conventional wars after their independence from Britain, or after partition. And he said at the human level, and Owen was a conservative, he wasn't doctrinaire in his religious beliefs. He was actually agnostic, but he did pretty conservative bloke, happily married with young children. But he said that in a point that was unpalatable for many conservatives to recognize, the most interdependent unit at the human level is the family. And it's in family environments where murders are more likely to going to happen because they know each other. You're more likely going to be murdered by someone than a stranger. So he was very skeptical of the liberal idea that interdependency would breed harmony. Yeah.
Yeah, or that, greater education and understanding would lead to peace and harmony. I think the other quotable quote is there was a lot of talk at the peak of globalization about the coming of the global village, as he put it, as if all would be sweetness and light. And he said, people that talk like that have never lived in a real village. We can be malicious and gossip.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And he also made the point that Europe in 1914, on the eve of the Great War, had achieved a degree of economic interdependence that was unprecedented. And that didn't stop World War One. So Owen thought that liberals and utopians alike needed to get mugged by reality if they really wanted to understand the world.
So,
I'll make this other point too about, utopian longings. He used to say it's hard to sustain utopian illusions if, for example, you live your life in Poland or Israel. It's easier if you're insulated from other major powers by 2 huge oceans and have neighbors who are too nice or too weak to threaten you, meaning the United States. That was a great line.
Thinking about the United Nations, tell us about the time that Owen was appointed as Australia's ambassador to UNESCO, the educational, scientific, and cultural organization. What did it find serving at, New York or wherever he served?
Well, he was first of all a senior advisor to the then conservative Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser from 1975, and that government from 1975 through to the early 80s. And in 1981, the Prime Minister appointed Owen as the Australian ambassador to UNESCO in Paris.
Oh.
And it was for 2 years. And Owen quickly earned a reputation, especially in America, but around Paris, as a leading critic of what he called, this is what he said about UNESCO, that it was a thoroughly politicized institution dedicated to attacking Western values and interests. And he made such a mark in Paris that American conservatives and neoconservatives alike, like Irving Kristol, encouraged Owen to move to Washington, which he did in 1983-84, to work first as a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. This was before he became the editor of the National Interest in 1985. And during that period in 83, 84 in Washington, it's widely believed that it was Owen who persuaded the Reagan administration to withdraw from UNESCO, which it did in 1984. And in those days, Owen would be in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Commentary Magazine, all too often on this very subject. He became almost a bit of a household name in Washington because of his criticisms of UNESCO. And he was influential. I mean, he influenced the Reagan administration to withdraw.
Um, I think the United Nations is very much an American idea, even though American conservatives may find themselves to be appalled by it. So, what went wrong with this international body?
Well, I think I would make the point that international institutions like the United Nations don't displace power politics, they just reflect it. So obviously they're going to reflect the interests of their most powerful members. And of course, during the Cold War, the Security Council was completely ineffective because of the superpower veto. It did have a brief renaissance after the Cold War. I mean, at one time, any American intervention, this is before 9/11, it was felt had to get a United Nations mandate to be legitimate. That kind of went out the window with 9/11 and the preemptive war in Iraq. But increasingly, too, I think what we're seeing with the United Nations, particularly in that period leading up to the war in Iraq, you may recall that the Chinese were relatively subdued in their criticism, and they saw an opportunity here with America going down a unilateral path to present themselses as the champion of multilateralism and to build up influence in these institutions and effectively a white hand so that they reflected China's preferences and values more than the original founders. So I think the United States actually missed an opportunity to rejuvenate this global system of institutions that was set up after World War II. And now I think it's really too late. I mean, the system continues, but it's ineffective. What would you say?
I think Sue's right there. I mean, and you are too, Chong, to acknowledge that the Americans really created the institution. And remember, it was President Woodrow Wilson after World War One who played the leading role in creating the League of Nations, which obviously failed in the 20s and 30s. But the UN is based on the League of Nations principle of collective security, and it's all about national self-determination. The American pendant for distinguishing itself from European power politics and protecting the little guy against big bullies. In principle, that's what the United Nations is about. And that's why the Americans, particularly American liberals and Democrats, embraced it, like Wilson and FDR. But I think the turning point was probably sometime in the 1970s when the UN General Assembly turned against America and Israel. And the last 50 years, America's had a hot and cold relationship with the United Nations.
Well, let's talk about the tragedy of great power politics, as John Mearsheimer puts it. I think the tragedy here is twofold. One is towards the great powers, because great powers often have deadlines and sell-by dates. There's no Soviet Union anymore. In the 19th century, Britain, France, and to an extent Germany were great powers, not so much today. And so there is an idea that America itself, the United States, may cease to be a great power. There was a time where it wasn't, of course, but there will be a time when it won't. So I wonder, to what extent has the holders of power in the American foreign affairs realized this reality? Yeah.
Well, I think opinion varies in Washington, but I think opinion varies in Washington about Russia as a great power. I think there's probably a mindset, particularly among liberals, that Russia was very badly beaten after the end of the Cold War and doesn't have the kind of legitimate interests that go with great powerdom. Hence, their belief that Russia's intervention in Ukraine is motivated by imperialism and not by defending its near abroad against Russian encroachment on its territory or or its neighborhood. But I think there's a widespread consensus. In fact, it's probably one of the few bipartisan issues in Washington these days that China is a rising great power and it wants to assert itself across East Asia. And America will and should go to great lengths to contain China's rise. I think that's a widespread view in Washington among Democrats and Republicans.
I think there's a big debate in the United States, and it's a very healthy one, about is America in decline, because it has been written off so many times before in the past. You could practically sell you a box set. It does have an incredible capacity for renewal and regeneration. I don't know, maybe is this time different? There are certainly fiscal limits to America's great power status. I think Neil Ferguson has come up with the proxy that when your debt servicing is greater than your military budget, it's a proxy for decline. But let's watch that space. When you asked the question, I was always reminded of a quip that Kishore Mahbubani, the former Singaporean diplomat, made, I think, on Tom's radio program a few years ago, and in reference to that unipolar moment, the article that Krauthammer wrote, he said it's going to take the Americans another 20 years before they'll even accept that the unipolar moment is over, let alone that they might be in decline.
Well, the second layer to the tragedy of great power politics is to what extent are the fates of the smaller powers depend on this great power conflict. I've been the two countries with the greatest landmass that I've been to are Canada and Australia, and I don't think Canada sees itself as a great power. I don't know if Australians see themselves as a great power, but so far, the great powers are United States and China. I believe the Prime Minister of Hungary made this metaphor of well, there are two suns in the sky pointing to these two nations. And I think Russia's trying to get into the great power game. But as we can see, I think, at least from the end of the Cold War, when great powers fight, smaller powers, often, I guess, get the damage of the scaffolding, as Tom alluded to. And in some ways, even if the great powers kids didn't make up, so to speak, as it was in the, say, the détente of the 70s, well, some smaller powers would get hurt. So what is the fate of the smaller powers, in Owens's viewpoints and, of course, in your personal view in this conflict?
Well, it depends on the region. I think, just with respect to the United States, I think its allies in East Asia, so Japan, its treaty allies are Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia, perhaps Thailand. And then there are all these other countries like Vietnam, for example, that are increasingly moving in America's strategic orbit because they're worried about China. My sense is that those countries are pretty supportive of the United States and are firmly on the US security bandwagon when it comes to hedging against China, even though all these states do have serious economic intercourse with the People's Republic. Europe, and maybe this is one area where Owen got it wrong. I think he'll ultimately be proven right. But Owen believed that with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that NATO, or the idea of a strategic West, would come to an end. I mean, as a culture and a political entity, there's still a West. But as a strategic alliance, it didn't make much sense in the post-Cold War era, because what united a strategic West was a fear of another power, in this case, the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, it made sense from Owen's perspective that Western Europe would probably go its own way from America. But that clearly has not happened. And if anything, one could make the argument that the last few years have showed how remarkably close Western Europe and North America are in the face of Putin's Russia. My own view is that over time, especially now with Donald Trump back in the White House, I think there'll be more pressure on the Western Europeans to do more for their own defense. And I can see a time when the Americans and the Western Europeans may see things a bit differently. But certainly in Asia, they're more united. And in the Middle East, it's especially now what's happened to the Iranian Shia crescent, Syria of President Assad, and Hamas and Hezbollah, and the pressure they've been inflicted. You can see the US security relations, treaty relationships or close relations with Saudi Arabia and the Sunni Gulf states and Israel remaining very strong. The thing about China, it is a rising great power, but it doesn't have really treaty allies. does it? He's got North Korea, Laos, Cambodia. I don't think you can really put Russia in their camp, although they are. I think they called it a no limits partnership at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis. But even there, Russia and China are not natural allies, are they? They've had serious strategic tensions in history. So I don't see that changing. No, America has more allies than any other great power in the world by far. No question.
I think the Southeast Asian countries very much see the US-China security competition as an opportunity to hedge and to try and maneuver and get the best from that situation by playing the two off against each other. I would say, with the exception of Indonesia and possibly even more so Malaysia, which I think has come pretty close to accommodate China. I think most Southeast Asian countries want to be on the winning side. Most haven't bandwagoned with the United States to the degree that Australia has. For that reason, I think they would like to see more demonstration of the pivot to Asia that never really happened, and more assets and more resources and more attention in Washington being focused on the region. So who knows under Trump if there is some resolution to the Ukrainian war and a negotiated peace, and America finally does reorder its force structure in ways that convince not just allies, but perhaps countries sitting on the fence that they're serious, then I think even countries like Indonesia would tilt more towards the United States. But Indonesia is very much a country like India, which has a long tradition of non-alignment and are very proud of its strategic autonomy. So they will play both sides to get the best advantage for them. Whereas Australia has unquestionably bandwagoned with the United States, and I would say so has Japan. We formed the triangle that Shinzo Abe used to talk about.
Well, back to Owen Harries. Tell me about his friendship with Irving Kristol, his fellow national interest editor.
Well, I think it's in the book. There's a chapter in the book, Sue. I think is it the extract.
Yeah, there's a long essay.
Yeah. So that was I was in Washington at the time when this essay appeared. It was a collection of essays co-edited by William Kristol, Irving's son, and Chris DeMuth, who was then the president of the American Enterprise Institute. And it was a collection of essays by Irving Kristol's friends in honor of Irving Kristol. And Owen wrote a chapter on the Australian connection, which was weird because Irving had never been to Australia, never really expressed any kind of curiosity about Australia. But of course, the Australian connection was Irving's close relationship with Owen. And, in the 60s, Owen would have definitely known of Irving, and Irving started to know of Owen because Owen, in the early 60s, when he was only in his early 30s, published not once but twice in Foreign Affairs magazine. Now you think about that. Early 60s, there's no internet. For any Australian, in fact, from anyone outside of Europe or America to be published in Foreign Affairs, which is the long-time journal of the East Coast Foreign Policy Establishment, pretty impressive. And to do so as an Australian in your early 30s. And his essays were on the the US-Soviet symmetry. And Irving took an interest in those essays. So they corresponded and they ultimately met in Manhattan in 1968. And from that moment onwards, they became very close friends. And Owen also made the point that it wasn't just his close relationship with Irving, but also Irving's wife, Bea Kristol, who was also known as Gertrude Himmelfarb. And when Gertrude died, shortly before Owen himself died, Owen was really quite sad. And he told me that in many ways his relationship with Gertrude was more important to him than his relationship was with Irving. And of course, that's not least because she was a very accomplished writer as well, So they obviously had this close relationship. And so ultimately it meant that in 1985, when Irving had the idea of creating a foreign policy magazine, he asked Owen to be his editor, and that was the national interest.
And true to Owen's form, I think the first essay that he published in the first issue was by Irving, where he argued that the idea of the nationals was dead beyond resurrection.
Okay. Well, I think that's where we can conclude, right? I think currently the national interest has basically paused its magazine publication. But of course, the idea of the national interest, I think, has gained a resurgence, both in America and Europe, and of course elsewhere too. So, how would Owen define the national interest?
A cold-eyed calculation of limits to power in a messy world that does not conform to anyone's expectation, and a recognition that other rising and even declining great powers have legitimate interests to protect. Yeah.
And I think in Australia's case, he would argue very strongly, the old dictum, no permanent friends, only permanent interests, very pointedly making that dictum apply to the US alliance. So I think he used to get very nervous when people started talking about 100 years of mateship and, shared values. And he used to always ask people, to think of an instance or a circumstance where our interests might diverge, even though we do share values. So he was always very wary of that kind of language, the alliance being like a marriage. But yes, permanent interests, not permanent friends.
I think that would be a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Tom and Sue of the Center for Independent Studies, for joining the program.
Thank you
Our
very
pleasure.
much. Thank you for taking such an interest in the book.
Yes, and of course, happy Christmas to you both.
Chung, just
Happy
before you go, I was
Christmas
just
to
going to say, I don't think we can get it online, Sue, but I think
No.
our friend here would really enjoy Owen's article in the April 1995 edition of Quadrant about the end of realism.
It's in the book.
It is in the book. The whole chapter?
No, not the full essay, but most of it. I think the one that
Okay.
Realism in a New Era. Is it that one?
Okay, that's the one. Okay, good.
Yeah,
I'd read
that's
that
a very
one.
good.
I'd read that. Because that I only suggest that because that actually he deals with first principles about realism and national interest. And he was writing at a time when the conventional wisdom believed in Fukuyama and Krauthammer. And they believed, as Bill Clinton himself put it in 1992 when he ran for president, that realism is ill-suited. And power politics was ill-suited to the new era. And Owen was very skeptical of all that.
I'll check it out. Thank you.
Okay, mate.
Thank
Lovely
you.
meeting you. Thank you for your interest. And when you come to Australia or come to Sydney, please look us up. We'll have dinner.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take you up on that. Thank you. Okay.
Please do.